Hello everyone, welcome to APUSH Simplified. Today we're looking at a very important primary source for Period 9, which is President George W. Bush's January 2002 State of the Union, also known as the Axis of Evil speech. Before talking about the details of the speech, let's take a look at the context. George W. Bush had won the controversial 2000 presidential election between he and former Democratic Vice President Al Gore. The controversy sprung from ballot counting issues in the state of Florida. Without going into too much detail, the Supreme Court ended the recount and gave the electoral votes to Bush, thus granting him the victory. When President Bush came into office, he was initially going to focus on domestic issues like education with his Leave No Child Behind initiative and cutting taxes. Unlike his father, the younger Bush did not have a lot of foreign policy experience. However, during the campaign, he had promised to be less interventionist. But he surrounded himself with his father's advisors like Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, and Dick Cheney. Most of his advisors were neoconservatives who believed the U.S. was the lone superpower and could act unilaterally. That means without needing or asking for world opinion or permission from allies or the United Nations. For Bush and the United States, everything changed early on in his presidency with the September 11th attacks, when terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes and used them to fly into the World Trade Center and Pentagon, and one crash landed in a field in Pennsylvania. Close to 3,000 people died in the attacks, and the U.S. and the world was in shock. President Bush vowed to hunt down those responsible for the attacks, of which the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, headed by their leader Osama bin Laden, took responsibility. Bin Laden and much of Al-Qaeda was based in the country Afghanistan, which was mostly controlled by the Taliban, an Islamic fundamentalist regime. The U.S. demanded the Taliban give up bin Laden, and they refused. So within a few weeks of the terrorist attacks, the U.S. aided Afghanistan's rebel groups and invaded the country, quickly toppling the Taliban regime. And the long hunt was on to find bin Laden. President Bush and his team did not want to stop at Afghanistan. They identified several other countries as a threat to the U.S. and global stability. Bush outlined this axis of evil, as he called it, and a new foreign policy strategy to deal with them. This will have far-reaching consequences for the U.S. and world. President Bush starts the speech stating that America and Afghanistan are now allies and Afghanistan is free. Also, America is helping rebuild Afghanistan. He's making a point that American intervention leads to good outcomes. He then goes on to discuss how terrorism is not defeated and names several places around the world that Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups operate. And the first goal is to shut down those terrorist camps, whether the countries that those camps are in want the U.S. to or not. President Bush then goes on to a second goal, which is to, quote, prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction, end quote. He specifically names North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, and he says, quote, the Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade, end quote. President Bush says the U.S. must stop these regimes from developing and spreading weapons of mass destruction, and the U.S. is prepared to act unilaterally, in which he says, quote, and all nations should know America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security, end quote. He goes on to talk about a few other topics, including the need to increase military funding and his domestic agenda. But our focus in this video is more on the foreign policy statements in the first half of the speech. Let's take a minute to look at President Bush's intentions. First of all, he has the point of view of a president dealing with a major crisis and the pressure to keep America safe from another terrorist attack. His messages to the American people and world is intending to both explain the immediate foreign policy goals of his administration and serve as a warning to nations that do not take action against terrorist groups within their borders and hostile nations that may be developing weapons of mass destruction. Now, taking a look at who would agree and disagree with President Bush's foreign policy statements, the neoconservatives within his administration, like his Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, would definitely agree. Bush also has a great deal of support from the American people. However, there is a significant portion of the population skeptical of the administration's aims with the axis of evil. Over the next year, the Bush administration will make the case for a war with Iraq. While some Americans support the action, there are protests in both the U.S. and around the world against military intervention in Iraq. The axis of evil speech has a huge impact and legacy on America and the world. The war in Iraq will be divisive both within the U.S. and throughout the globe. Some of America's allies do not participate in the war in Iraq. While the vicious leader Saddam Hussein is quickly deposed of, however, no weapons of mass destruction were found. And the transition to a peaceful and democratic Iraq proves to be very difficult as sectarian violence between the Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds becomes commonplace. Whether a politician was initially for or against the war will be a major issue of every presidential campaign afterward. President Bush is also accused of taking the focus off of Afghanistan, finding bin Laden, and destroying Al-Qaeda. And some will say the war in Iraq actually makes the specter of terrorism and terrorist groups worse. The dust is settling on these decisions, and historians, along with the American people, will be debating this speech and actions that followed for many years. Okay, that does it for this primary source. Subscribe to the channel for more APUSH simplified content.